podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the fifth Sunday in Lent for the week of March 22nd, 2026. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I am excited with how this week came together, kind of what was going on within my brain, and then going through the text. And I think this will be a fun week because as we are in the middle of Lent, there is so much of self-reflection that happens. I think it's really easy for us to overlook how that self-reflection and internal wrestling and internal improvement and things that we're trying to do to connect better with God also means that gives us the opportunity to look beyond ourselves and looking at what our impact can do to impact others as well. How can we be doing things that is impacting others around us and not being purely turned toward ourselves? And especially being a person in the United States, I think that's something that a lot of us need to wrestle with and deal with. Is sometimes we make too many of our life decisions about us and not enough about thinking about how is it affecting others as well. Yes, you don't want to go too far one way or too far the other way, but it's the aspect of having that balance and considering that, I think, is a vital aspect to just being a human being and being a person of faith in particular. I think it's also vitally important, and it's something that's very easy for us to overlook. And it makes us, I think, a little bit easier for us to follow through with the question that I had for last week, which was, where do we need to be less cynical? And one of the things that I received back was an interesting bring back reminiscence on the radar rage when microwaves first started coming out and how there was a lot of skepticism of what was going on. And once we understand that it's a light energy that's being moved through and it's just exciting the water molecules, that really isn't having a super big effect on the food in and of itself. Now, there's definitely things that you can argue and things that can be talked about on how there's still things that are being affected. And I think there's debate and things to be looked at and continue to be going through with that. But the aspect on how our default at times can be cynical when things are changing, or how for us when things are different, how it's so easy to just immediately jump and say this is wrong or we shouldn't do it this way. And sometimes we need to be more open. And I think in doing that, it allows us to actually have the Spirit of God come in and welcome us to these new spaces, welcome the new understandings, the new gifts of what God is trying to present to us. And I think that leads a little bit into especially this first reading this week, which is out of Ezekiel chapter 37, the first 14 verses of it. And this is one of those readings where Ezekiel is talking about a prophecy that he is having of dream-esque, or this revelation that he has had with the Lord. And they're talking about how they're out there and they find this pile of bones. And the Lord says to prophesy to these bones. And suddenly these bones, as the Lord predicts and says, start growing sinew and flesh. And you have this body that isn't having the breath of life in it, but this body that is now alive. And so then the Lord says to prophesy to these bones. And when it does, then there becomes breath within them. And we get here at the end of Ezekiel how this is a metaphor for the people of Israel, that God has not abandoned them. God is in their midst and working within them and trying to put the Spirit within them, as long as we are willing and able to receive it and being able to recognize the Spirit of that. The psalm this week then is Psalm 130, all 8 verses of it. And this then is a psalm of just lament, crying out to the Lord and trying to make sure that the Lord sees what is going on, asking for forgiveness, but that we're waiting. This lament of, I'm still here, I'm still wanting something, God, but yet I'm still waiting and I'm hoping and I'm leaning into that steadfast love. It's this deep desire that is within us to be able to be redeemed, be able to be restored, be able to connect deeper with God. And thus there's longing and wanting, but also this huge hope that is also still there. The epistle text or second reading this week is out of Romans chapter 8, starting in verse 6 through 11. And this then is recognizing that our flesh falls short of the goals of what God has wanted for us. And thus we need this righteousness. We need this forgiveness that God gives, and recognizing that the Spirit of God also still dwells within this body. That in doing that, in connecting with God and being able to work with God, that God still utilizes this. Even though our flesh may fail, the Spirit of God that is within us will continue to prevail long after our physical bodies are still here. The gospel text this week is out of John chapter 11, the first 45 verses of chapter 11, another long reading this week. And it's one of these weeks, I would also say, where we're getting a little bit more of the descriptive text, a little bit more of the interactive narrative that John typically brings into his gospel. But it's this familiar story of how Jesus is with his disciples and they get message that Mary and Martha's brother Lazarus is ill. And they're sending this message to him. Jesus is really not overly concerned about it. He states in verse 4, it's an illness that's not going to lead to death, but rather for God's glory, and that the Son of God may be glorified through it. So Jesus waits another 2 days. He then eventually comes. So what ends up happening? At that moment, we have Martha coming and meeting the rabbi and just kind of questioning, if you had only been here, my brother would still be alive. He is stating he's all but asleep. And his disciples are a little bit confused by this. Like, why are we going and visiting then if he's all but asleep? And he just kind of puts it plainly that he's dead. And this then is where Martha comes in and greets them, and again is kind of lamenting why Jesus wasn't there. And Jesus then continues to come back. And again, there's also these factors on this is near Jerusalem. There has been stirring of what Jesus has done in different places. And so there's a little bit of tension, and this is coming after the healing of the blind man that we had last week. So there is just this raised tension that's already starting to happen in Jesus's ministry, but he continues on. And as he's there, again, he then eventually gets met by Mary. And when that happens, again, she is stating, if you'd only been here. But Jesus then instead asks, can you bring me to the tomb, and ask for the stone to be rolled away? There's a key detail that is also brought up, especially for the culture of the time, that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. In the culture of that time, the spirit of that person stayed around for 3 days after the death. And so this is saying that the spirit of the person has completely left, that this is dead. This is bones. This is just rotting flesh is all that should be here. They roll away the stone, even though there is worry that there's going to be quite this stench. And Jesus first cries out to God, recognizing that God is always hearing, always going to be there, and then believing that Jesus has been sent for this and is also kind of doing this as an acknowledgement to the people that are around. He cries out for Lazarus to come out, and Lazarus comes out. He asks for them to unbind him, and we get then in verse 45. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary, had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. And again, this is coming off of the blind man receiving sight. So there's this aspect of Jesus building these people on, wow, look at what Jesus is doing. Look at all these things that are being totally transformed in front of us. He is quite the disruptor. But before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, different ways of thinking about the text, and hearing from different biblical scholars, and having the back catalog that they have over at Working Preacher. I'd highly recommend using that as a resource just to help you get into these texts and think about how other people are looking at these texts. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend using the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also having art, prayers, hymns, different readings to help you get into the text week to week, maybe breaking it down into bite size or having some additional readings to help get the most out of it. So whether you are in front of the pews or in the pews on Sunday mornings or whenever you have worship, I find these are an amazing resource that I feel like get a little bit underutilized. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies within the weekly lectionary texts, like what I've been doing week after week. And if you enjoy that, I know you're going to enjoy that. Otherwise, they also have a monthly newsletter that goes through resources, different events, different footnotes, or even different ecological ideas that often includes a lot of the things that are the weekly reflections also to be looking at. So if you haven't checked out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable or the Green Blades Rising publications, that'll be the first link down in the show notes in the references section, and make sure to check that out. It's a great resource over there. This week, what we are looking at and discussing is the aspect of how at times what we see as dead and gone is not the perception of, well, God works and plays with the idea of dead and gone. And there's no better example of that than Lazarus, making sure that of the time that he is quote unquote dead, he is quote unquote gone. There is nothing that can be done for him. And yet Jesus goes and does things that surprise people yet again. And I think it shows us the resilience of what God has for us. But I think it also then should show us and help remind us of the resilience of God's creation as well. If that is a characteristic of who God is, that we can see that God has this care for God's creation to build in where people are resilient, or when things look dire, that it doesn't always end up being that way with God, then we have to be able to recognize that and acknowledge that within the creation in which God also created. There was one that kind of stumbled across my feed this last week as I was thinking about and looking through these texts. And it was a study that was done in May of 2023 in Royal National Park, which is just south of Sydney, Australia. For nearly 50 years, the park had been void of platypus. And the reason that they weren't there is because of pollution, because of human interaction had made it so it was incredibly difficult and thus to the point of impossible for these platypuses to live. So they went extinct in that area. They died out. That population was no longer there. So in May of 2023, after being gone for 50 years, there were 10 platypuses that were re-released into Royal National Park. When they came back a year later, they found that there were now juveniles that were there, and thus they even released a few more. And what was that a sign of? It had been a sign of, first, that the land and the water in particular that the platypuses use had recovered. The different pollution and things that were in that water that had caused or been a major cause to their dying out in that location had been removed and had been cleaned up. And thus they had been reintroduced to the point where now they were having their own young and the beginning process of turning over that ecosystem. Now, this is something that we have talked about time and time and time again, this aspect of reintroduction. We've talked about it with gray wolves in Yellowstone has been a major and probably the most famous study on how the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone drastically impacted the mountainside with the trees that were growing, to the aspect of the elk having to move and not just eating all the different trees that were there, allowing them to be able to actually have more soil and thus having the trees develop better root systems so there was less erosion. And this is stuff that was all predicted by the Thinking Like a Mountain by Aldo Leopold that he wrote in the 1920s and 30s. This aspect on when we look at these things, and the aspect of platypuses was pollution in the water where we were trying to industrialize and we just took over, or when we look at gray wolves, seeing them as a threat, that thus we didn't realize the aspect on how taking these things out was potentially having long-term ramifications. Another one that we've talked about in years past before also is like bald eagles here in the United States, and how in the United States, which there's still progress that needs to be done with this, but we have banned DDT based off of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring being a major contributor to that, recognizing on how DDT was directly affecting the calcium deposits within these major raptors, specifically like bald eagles, and thus pulling DDT out of the ecosystem has allowed for the bald eagles to have young and thus having the population soar. But there's plenty of these examples from around the world. Plains bisons also here in North America, but even like the Arabian onyx and how they went extinct in 1972, and then taking captive populations and being able to bring them back, slowly reintroducing them into Oman in 1982, where there are now roughly about 1,100 of them across Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. This then is also continued into other ones where we've seen more success. California condor being one where we're being able to go from 27 individuals in breeding captivity in San Diego to where now there are several hundred, and even within the last couple years, getting to have California condors expanding over the Grand Canyon for the first time in nearly a century is huge. And we've been seeing it in various different places around the world. The Eurasian beaver, bringing that back into various different places of the UK, and how the effect of having beavers has also helped reduce flood efforts by upwards of 60%. Having Eurasian lynx coming back and allowing them to be able to reestablish their populations. And even more recently, bringing back jaguars into Argentina, into the Abalis wetlands in particular, and thus, again, with them being a keystone species and having a cascading effect through the whole ecosystem by them being there, and thus also bringing more tourism as people want to see these amazing animals. In all these effects, it's one of the things where, as humans, one of the things that I find consistently, unfortunately, is if we feel threatened in some way, it's very easy for us to say, let's get rid of this, or turn a blind eye to it, or see that it's prohibiting our advancement in some form or some fashion, or prohibiting us from continuing doing the things that in the way that we think they should be done. And we start putting other things aside, and we start saying that's not important, or we say them disappearing isn't fine, it's not going to affect anything. The problem is with that mindset is we aren't recognizing the long-term ramifications of that, not only in the ecosystem, but how we interact with the ecosystem and how we interact with our neighbor. Jesus still went when it seemed dire, when it seemed like everything was done, was over. There's nothing more that can be done. He's been dead for 4 days. It's not worth it. His spirit has left him, in quotes. There's nothing more that can be done. And there's a lot of times when we start losing different species in areas, or we see that they're threatened or endangered, it's like at times as humans, we start seeing, well, it's over. It's done. There's nothing that can be done anymore. And that's where I feel like the hope that we should be carrying as Christians needs to shine through. It shows that there is work that needs to be done, but hope is not lost. There is work that needs to be done, but hope is not lost. The California condor is an amazing example of this. When you have 27 individuals in captivity, and that's the whole world population, that looks pretty bleak. And in a lot of ways it is. There is biological things that are scary about that. You have bottleneck. There is not a lot of genetic diversity. Thus, if there is something that happens where it's like some genetic disease or something that comes along that ends up being a virus that they have a hard time dealing with, it's very easy to potentially lose the whole species. And yes, when you are able to get them where now there are several thousand flying out in the wild, that's awesome, but they're still in a lot of ways highly threatened because of the lack of diversity. But yet, that is not a reason to say it's done, it's over, it's not worth pursuing. California condors have huge impact within the areas in which they're in. They're huge at being able to help clean things up. With not having feathers on their face, they can eat dead animals and thus helping to prevent the spread of different bacteria and different diseases because they're cleaning it up. It's an important job. It's not a pretty job. I wouldn't say that the California condor is the prettiest animal on the face of the planet by any means, but it's an important role to play within that ecosystem. And they're huge, fascinating birds. When we look at the Eurasian beaver and how it's having impact within the UK and Europe by reducing flood efforts. Yes, it's capturing carbon and helping in some of those ways, but it's also transforms the whole ecosystem. They are able to move rivers and have things change by recognizing things that need to be done. And it has these impacts for everything around it. It's this recognition then that we are part of something much bigger, much greater, that we're all connected to. That the beaver impacts us and we impact the beaver, both interacting. And that the interactions that we have together also impact the bird species, the fish species, the wolves, the coyotes, the mammals that are around, the amphibians that are around. They're all connected together. And does that not sound like the reading we have in Ezekiel this week? That the dry bones then start having sinews and you start having muscles and flesh, and then we get breathed in the breath of life, and suddenly you have something that is living and breathing in front of you. The Spirit of God is flowing through that. I believe that when Ezekiel is prophesying this, it is not purely meant just as human. I think this is also connecting us back to the earth and recognizing that, yes, we are dust and the dust we shall return, but we are also interacting with this earth and are part of this earth. The tribe of Israel is part of this earth, and it's not just in human form. The redemption that we're crying out for in Psalm 130 is not just the redemption and mercy upon us. It's this redemption and mercy within creation in and of itself, and giving us the insight and the ability to be able to see where that restoration needs to happen. And when that restoration has gotten to the point where we can reintroduce platypuses, we can reintroduce Eurasian lynx, we can reintroduce Arabian onyx. These are important to recognize where, yes, we have not only messed up, but then continue to work on that mess up because God continues to do that within us. And so thus we continue to do that to the point where we are able to reintroduce species that were meant to be there. It looks bleak at times. It looks like it's dead, it's gone, there's nothing more that we can do, but yet we have these success stories that should be empowering us to move forward instead of just saying, well, let's just continue on with what we are accustomed to. This is Lent. We aren't supposed to always be comfortable. We're Christians. That isn't what God calls us into, is comfortability with our faith. God calls us into, at times, challenging things. This is where we need to have that better connection with the ecosystem around us, human and non-human, to be able to recognize that in that, we are better as a whole because of it. This is why I feel the raising of Lazarus is so important. It seems bleak. It seems over. The narrative has written itself, but yet Jesus still goes. Jesus still spends time. Jesus still mourns. He weeps. But yet Jesus then also still helps restore. It is the weeping, also not just the weeping with Mary and Martha, but is it also the weeping of the lack of understanding of what God can do? It's the weeping of the past and us anticipating and predicting and seeing this is the limits of what God can do. And God weeps because, oh, but you child, you have so little faith. You do not understand. I think there's a lot of times we give up way too quickly. There's times that we see that the challenge of doing something different is too big. We mourn the change, and yet we then also are missing out on the opportunity of what's coming. We cut short what God can do. We cut short of what our role within that is as well. I know one of the things that I at times will dig into is I enjoy listening to car creators, and there's this whole debate and prognosis on electric vehicles versus internal combustion engines. And I think there's times where we like moving the goalposts. We like making all these assumptions and trying to keep things the way they were, and don't recognize there is also a beauty in the new and what we have been able to discover. And in that, we're also recognizing there is a huge possibility here of reducing our impact on the environment and how that's affecting everything else that we're doing. And maybe that's then something worth pursuing. And yes, there is still a lot of things with even looking at electric that still need to be cleaned up environmentally. I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, but it's a step in a direction that could potentially help us globally, not just for us humankinds, but for us who aren't human as well. And I think that's the type of discussion that isn't happening enough. That's the type of thing where we cut God short. That's the type of thing that we just don't want to assume that responsibility. We give up because then we don't have to take on that responsibility. And it's easier because then God fits beautifully into this little box. There's nothing I can do, God. I'm not picking that up. And yet, I would argue that that's not what God is wanting us to do. God has called us to be the gardener. God has called us to step into these things. And we even see this week, especially within Ezekiel and within the Romans text, that God continues to breathe through us and to not just give up because we think it's hard, we think it's difficult, we think it's hopeless. So the question I have for you this week is, where do we need to keep going even when it seems hopeless? Where do we need to keep going even when it seems hopeless? Because I think there are times that we do that and we don't even recognize that we're doing that. And especially within Lent, when we're doing a lot of this reflection, I think we need to be doing that. We need to remember some of these amazing success stories that we've had, but it should be also inspiring us to go out and continuing to work and transform our own faith to be that and not be cutting ourselves so short so quickly. This whole process of us analyzing our impact and how it doesn't just affect us, and it doesn't just affect humans, it affects God's whole creation. And we need to, as Christians, I think, be thinking about that more and striving to help the world continue to see the beauty of the whole world, not just the human part of it. I think that's a hard conversation, a difficult conversation. And I think that's where it's easy for us to say, why roll away the stone? It's going to stink. He is dead. There is nothing we can do, Jesus. He's dead. He's been dead for 4 days. Don't put yourself through that. I don't want to reopen up these wounds. And Jesus says, you don't know what you are talking about. Open the tomb, calls out to Lazarus, and Lazarus comes out. Unbandage this man and let him go. I think within our own faith, I think there's times that we need to be unbandaged, unbound, and let go and let the Spirit of God within us flow more freely. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.